Solidarity has accused FlySAFair of dragging its feet in resolving the ongoing pilot strike as the strike enters its second week. The union says talks to end the strike collapsed when the airline reportedly refused to negotiate into the weekend. Solidarity says despite a final offer from FlySAFair, the airline has failed to address the issue of fatigue, unpredictable schedules and a lack of a guaranteed rest. For more on this, let's now bring in FlySAFair's Chief Marketing Officer, Kirby Gordon, together with Solidarity spokesperson Helgard Cronje. Let's start off with you, Kirby. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. We understand that there was a final offer that was put on the table over the weekend. Are you able to take us into your confidence what that final offer was?
Look, I think the specifics of the offer are still under debate largely, and I'm sure that my colleague here will get into the specific details of what that was. The reality is that there is no hesitation for ongoing conversations in good faith. The conversation on Friday concluded with an agreement that the airline would submit a proposal in writing to the pilot body, which would then be subject to a vote. That was promptly done on Saturday morning. The vote then was concluded yesterday at 4:30.
At 4:30, and what was the result of that?
It was declined.
It was declined. Okay. And then, Helgard, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning as well. Are you able to tell us what the offer was and why your members rejected it?
Good morning, Aldrin. Look, I'm going to summarize it. To read it to you would not serve any purpose. I think the main concerns from our side regarding the offer is that the offer in terms of the rostering system had no meaningful commitments. The offer was vague and it doesn't set proper rules where pilots have actual input into the rostering system to address their concerns. They basically proposed a committee, for example, where some pilot representatives would serve on, but we've had these committees over the last 6 months. And essentially, they don't have any power, no decision-making power, and most of their recommendations in the past have been overruled by EXCO in any event. So there's no meaningful input. Parties talk, recommendations are made, and nothing really happens. Furthermore, the proposals were vague, and it leaves several legal loopholes that doesn't protect the rights of our members. And that's what we're looking for. The company made it clear that their major concern is that they don't want to give up any operational control. But essentially, if both parties are protected in terms of an agreement, it does not give operational control to the employees or the pilots. It just protects their minimum rights, which is what we are seeking. It's not a principle that is unfamiliar in South Africa. We have the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. You have contracts of employment where an employer and an employee agrees on specific minimum rights being protected. And that's all we are seeking for these pilots, nothing more. Essentially, that is what the company is unwilling to give, is to protect those minimum rights and commit them in writing in a proper agreement between pilots and the employer.
Okay, so does this mean that there's been an agreement insofar as the wage dispute is concerned?
Not yet. We've made it clear that essentially we want to resolve the roster dispute, and then discussions regarding the wage increase can continue. Our pilots have made it clear that their major concern is the rostering dispute, and they want to resolve that.
Yeah.
They've also made it clear that they are amenable on the wage increase should there be a settlement on the roster dispute.
Yeah, but isn't this shifting the goalposts? And I'll come back to Kirby now, Helgard, because initially I thought that the agreement was let's first deal with the wage dispute, and then after the wage dispute has been dealt with, then you move on to the issues relating to the roster.
It's a very valid and reasonable question, and essentially the company moved the goalpost because we gave a strike notice that was pertaining to the wage increases, and the company then locked our pilots out and included the rostering dispute and indicated in that lockout notice that should our pilots want to come back to work, they need to accept the rostering proposal from the company and the wage increase. So essentially the company brought it in legally when they issued the lockout notice.
Yeah. Kirby, did you shoot yourselves in the foot here?
No, I don't believe so at all. I think to address a couple of those concerns, first of all, the protections that are in place for the pilot which were mentioned by Helgard are all very much in place. The basic conditions of employment certainly do apply to these employees. Equally, there are South African civil aviation laws and regulations that are in place that limit the numbers of hours and the operational requirements that the pilots are subject to. And of course, they do all have contracts with the company as well that put those protections in place. The fundamental issue here, as Helgard did outline, is around the idea that the union and the pilot body seek operational control over what the roster looks like. Now, there's an important and fundamental thing that needs to be understood with regard to that. The idea is that if operational control becomes a matter of substantive negotiations, the reality is that those then pile upon one another on a year-on-year basis. And we've seen this in a number of other airlines along the way. So the reality is that every reasonable request that comes into play then piles on top of one another. And ultimately, you arrive at a situation where productivity of pilots is very much constrained by virtue of what the airline is able to do. Now, this has been seen as a key element that erodes the resistance of airlines that have not made it in South Africa in the recent past. So what the company had put forward, which I think was very, very clear, not at all vague and very meaningful, was the opportunity to put together a roster committee that would allow the company to preserve the key operational and productivity requirements that are set out in favor of allowing the pilots the full capability of being able to test and understand exactly what rules they would want in place. So rather than sign up for a rule within the substantive negotiations, it would allow for them to be able to then determine and change in time what those rules would look like in order to preserve their lifestyle while at the same time balancing the productivity requirements of the airline. So to put that into a specific example, one of the demands is for a weekend off every 4 weeks, or a weekend off every 4 weeks, which is what they are putting in as a specific. Now, the nature of that demand is not unreasonable, and in fact, actually, it is something that the company has agreed to. Currently, we have a weekend off every 6 weeks, so it's not as though it's not something that the company is willing to entertain or has in place. But the reality is that putting that into writing in a substantive agreement like this, which would last for 3 years, is something that is A, principally flawed, and B, is something that could be managed and would be managed very much by this committee. Ultimately, these things are always a give and take. So, for example, we have a rule in place at the moment that says any day off needs to be 2 consecutive days. A very reasonable proposal that's in place. It mirrors a weekend, and it allows pilots the opportunity to have rest. When pilots then bid for leave against this particular sample, we're only able to accommodate 20% of those leave requests because of that particular rule. If that rule is, and this is a hypothetical, released, and we're allowed to say, let's give you a day off as a standalone day in amongst those 2-day off weekends, we're then able to accommodate 80% of leave requests. So at the end of the day, these are the kinds of things that this roster committee would look to balance and, of course, work underneath the guise of the majority of what the union members would seek.
So Helgard says that it's not the first time that there's been a proposal of such a committee and they haven't really been fruitful before. What's your experience around such a committee, Kirby?
Well, perhaps they've not been properly structured. I think if the right parameters are in place and they are appropriately structured, the reality is that we would then be able to manage that in a meaningful sense.
Okay, let's go to Helgard again. Helgard, what happens at the end of this weekend if there's still no resolution to the dispute?
Look, I mean, essentially, our members have indicated that they are still on strike. It's interesting, I think Kirby indicated previously that many of our members are returning to work. I think the outcome of the vote made it clear that all those people didn't go back to work. I think furthermore, these committees were properly structured and they need to be looked at. I think discussions need to be had surrounding SAFair's commitment to agree to some of these rules and principles. They want the absolute power to decide and change as they go. That's why they don't want to put them in writing. And that is not operational control. That's controlling the life of a pilot, and that stretches too far. And essentially, that's what we are looking at. They need to be serious. They need to understand that the majority of their pilots aren't happy and they don't trust the company. Otherwise, we would not be sitting here. Their proposal entails that their pilots trust them with this operational control, but they don't. And as soon as they realize that reality, I think they need to come back to the negotiating table seriously.
Have you seen any resignations, Helgard?
Yes, as far as we know, there were 10 resignations over the last month. I'm not sure exactly how many people have resigned over the year. This is hearsay. We get the feedback from our pilots. Essentially, the company would have more details on that. But the reality is, a pilot, and I think Guy Leach wrote about this, he's an aviation expert, can earn basically 3 times more than he earns at SAFair when he goes and flies globally. So essentially, if we talk about the long-term sustainability of the company, we also need to talk about keeping pilots in South Africa.
All right. And Kirby, your response to that, if you speak about the trust that pilots have in the company, but on the other end you have like 10, according to Helgard, and you'll tell us what your numbers are telling you, of pilots that have resigned in the last month alone.
I think Helgard mentioned it himself. That's hearsay. The reality is the number and absolute values of pilots that are moving through the organization is not really a specific value to achieve. What one should look at is a rate and understand what that looks like over time and whether or not there is an increase in that. So when we take a look at that, we obviously have no concerns. And the reality is, let's be honest, it would be a business decision.
Do you have pilots that are resigning though?
Every single month, and new ones that start.
Can you give us an idea of how many? How many in the past month?
I don't have a specific number, but we review the rate all the time in terms of a metric of health in the organization, and it is stable. The reality is it would be a business decision, a clear and unemotional and very logical business decision. If we were losing pilots as a result of not paying them significantly, we would need to pay them more in order to attract more pilots and keep them there. There's nothing untoward about that, and no one would withhold it. That's a very logical kind of approach to take. With regard to the global salaries and out there, the reality is that anyone that would work abroad would earn more. My housekeeper would probably call 50,000 Rand a month if she was working abroad. The reality is that it's about a lifestyle measure. So there's a little phenomenon in economics called purchasing power parity. And what that means is that somebody who lives abroad and works abroad obviously has a certain lifestyle that they can afford. Yep. So the reality is within the South African context, what we need to do is benchmark salaries according to what the current market looks like. And FlySAFair pilots are regularly benchmarked and they are very competitively remunerated. Equally, before Helgard mentions that there's a claim that pilots are 10% behind where they were during COVID, this is not true at all. Our pilots had their salaries reinstated within 2020, still when we reached a specific threshold of 86 flights a day. And more than that, the calculation shows that they earn now 45% more than they did at COVID time. So that also is unfortunately a baseless accusation.
But just quickly then, Kirby, in conclusion, for your passengers, what's your message to them for this particular week? What are the plans? And what happens if, as Helgard has said, that the instruction from their members at least is that the strike continues come the end of the weekend?
So operationally, we're continuing a very, it's a pared down schedule, but it's a very stable schedule as per your report at the airport. All departures are crewed and are leaving on schedule as they are. At this stage, we have more than 2/3 of our pilots that are back at work. We know who's reporting this morning, so they are certainly there. And the reality is we've shaved down the schedule by about 30%, which is sustainable. So obviously our operation is now smaller, reflecting a smaller pilot base, excluding those that are currently involved in industrial action. And from this point forward, we continue negotiations in good faith.
All right. And Helgard, you're also willing to continue those negotiations in good faith?
Yes, absolutely. Well, we want to expedite them. Unfortunately, the company walked out late on Friday evening. We thought we can continue, but it doesn't seem like they're interested in concluding this as quickly as we should.
All right. Thank you so much. Kirby Gordon is FlySAFair's Chief Marketing Officer, and Helgard Cronje is speaking on behalf of Solidarity.